Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
You will have more than one marriage with your husband, in the sense that I'm not the exact same person I was when we got married 30 something years ago. So we've had to kind of continue to learn with each other. But doing that actually keeps a spark alive. It's not going to feel quite like the original chemistry, but it's still going to be really strong.
Hey friend, you're listening to the AllMomDoes podcast, part of the Purposely Podcast Network. Here is your fair dues warning. We are going to be having a big girl conversation today about a big girl topic, and we are going to do our best to be very respectful and at the same time honest and direct. So go dig those AirPods out of the bottom of the diaper bag or the backpack or whatever you've got. This is one of those that, because I want you to have great information and straightforward information, we are going to be talking very directly, and we're going to be talking about a certain component of marriage. Okay, that's it. There's the warning. Go do the thing. Find the headphones. And here we go. Okay, I'm so glad you're here today because, as you can imagine, we get a lot of PR packages that come across the desk, different books, different podcasts, different artists, different creatives, all kinds of different things. People who have some great information for you about the life you're living and the kids and the husband and the job and all the stuff. And we love it. And every now and then I get an inquiry from someone and I just raise a hallelujah, which is what happened with this. I had somebody reach out to me and they said, hey, we've got this great book coming out and it's on this particular topic. And when I saw the topic, I knew it had to be on the podcast. So how's all that for a big buildup, a big, kind of guess what's in the gift box? So I'm going to tell you right now, when I was in vocational ministry and working with women all the time, this is a topic that came up. Oh, I can't even begin to tell you how many times this came up, which is when there's a mismatched sex drive in a marriage and it's the wife who has the higher desire. And so I have someone on today who is just an expert in this field. She is a counselor. She has written and made a big part of her career about sex and marriage. I want you to welcome Jay Parker. Jay, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. And what a build-up there with the introduction. I hope I can live up to that.
I have no doubt that you can. I truly, very honestly, was so excited to see this come across. Immediately reached out to your publicist, Ann, and said, when can we get Jay on? Because I have to tell you, I had this come up again and again and again. And here's what's wild about it. So often, I think, particularly in our faith circles, we have this assumption that guys have the higher sex drive. We sort of don't even have conversation about what happens when a wife has a higher sex drive. So when I realized that you had done the deep dive, you'd done the research, you had looked at all the different stuff, I was so excited to have this conversation because I know how meaningful it would have been to have had a resource to have you speak into a lot of the women who were coming to me who were confused, who were worried about what this might mean. They were worried about, have I done something wrong? Does my husband not want me? Is there another factor at play here that I don't know about? Thank you for addressing such an important topic. Jay, I want to hear how you really came into this world going, okay, somebody needs to say something about this. We got to talk about this.
So actually what happened is I started a blog 14 years ago called Hot, Holy, and Humorous, and that is still my website. And I started that because I felt like God was pushing me to speak into this area. I found myself oftentimes in private conversations with women trying to encourage them in their marriages to have healthy, holy, enjoyable sex. And I had my own redemption story in this area. And so I felt God prodding me to do something in there. So I started this blog. But I was only a year or two in when I started hearing from wives who were saying, I'm the one. And I'm tired of reading stuff saying, women, you need to help your husbands. You need to be available sexually and all of this stuff. And as it turns out, in my own marriage, I had been everything. I have been equally matched to my husband when we were first married. After the kids came, I had undiagnosed postpartum depression and some other issues, and my drive took a big drop. But then after some time, I actually became the higher desire spouse. So it was really useful for me to have been through all of those things. And I realized I really wanted to speak to these women. And so I started writing some posts for them. And every time I did, the response was just huge.
Wow. Wow. I saw that you saw research that indicated that about in 25% of marriages, it's the woman who's saying, I have the higher desire. And I shared with you before we started recording of the women who were coming to me feeling like they were in a mismatch situation when it came to sexual drive. Again, mine is a little more anecdotal, not clinical, but I was seeing at least maybe 50% or higher of the women who were coming to me saying, we are mismatched. How do you define the mismatch? What does that mean? Does that mean that, my spouse or I want sex 2-3 times a week and the other person only wants it once? Like, how do you define what that means?
That's a great question. So I think we kind of all know when there is a mismatch, and it's a little harder to define because, as far as frequency, it can be quite different. You can have one higher desire spouse who's wanting to have sex once or twice a week, and the other one is wanting less than that. You can have someone else who wants it 3 or 4 times a week. And so it kind of depends on the couple. And what actually makes it a mismatch is the couple itself. So it's possible sometimes that you might have been the lower desire spouse if you had married someone else.
Mm-hmm.
But you are now the higher desire spouse because it's relative to who you married. And so I think the mismatch is essentially one of you is feeling that there is this gap, that you are not satisfied with the sexual intimacy in your marriage. And that's not to say that the lower desire spouse is always satisfied by any means, but it's almost like they're left hungry. And for them, usually for higher desire spouses, it's also a matter of connection. They feel emotionally neglected when the regular sexual intimacy that they want is not happening.
Okay. So specific to the couple is how we really need to take a look at this, that it can mean different things for different people. You just know that something is not matching up.
And there could be small gaps and large gaps. So you could have someone who's just a little off and they need a little tinkering on the edges to work out this gap. You also have some situations where he's just not showing up to have sex hardly at all. And if you are having sex 10 times or fewer in a year in your marriage, that is actually clinically considered a sexless marriage.
Right. I've heard those stats before. Do you know how many couples in the US today are in that, if you will, qualifying rank of a sexless marriage, meaning 10 times or less per year?
Off the top of my head, I'm not going to give you an exact, but the last time I looked, I want to say it was just a little bit under 10%. So
Okay.
it's quite a few. And they usually, in the research, they usually actually put together married and long-term committed couples. So just to let you know.
Yeah, to know that that's part of the data. I am curious. I'm asking this way off the cuff, but I'm curious if you think this is a phenomenon that is fairly new, or if maybe this is the way it's been for several generations and we just didn't have the conversations or the vernacular or the disclosure that we were seeing these kinds of gaps where we can see up to a quarter, in marriages of women saying, I'm the one with the higher drive. Is it a recent phenomenon? Is it something that we have a hard time knowing? What do you think?
I think it's always been here, like for all of history. One of the things that we need to remember is that we women are sexual beings. God made us as sexual beings to have desire, to enjoy the experience. We have parts of our body that respond in certain ways, that we can feel arousal, we can feel pleasure. And plenty of women throughout history have experienced wonderful sexual intimacy and desired it. And so I think it's not unusual to say in some marriages, he's going to want more. In some marriages, she's going to want more. In some marriages, they're going to be fairly matched. That's very normal. As far as what the percentages are, I think those can vary. And I say that looking at all the research I could possibly find on this, I think it's no less than 15%. And it is probably more like 25% of marriages, which for me, I think when people think that, when they hear a percentage, they need to break it down to say the next time that you're sitting in church or a PTA meeting or a concert or whatever, look around and think every fourth wife here is likely wanting sex more than her husband. And I do think, though, in the recent years, I think there's been an increase in young women who are the higher desire spouse. And I have some reasons in the book for that I'm happy to discuss. But I do think it has shifted a little bit more for younger people so that, and I say younger people as a 57-year-old woman, FYI, listeners out there. But I do think there's been a shift with men being lower desire than their wives in more cases.
I want you to unpack for me what some of the causality of a lower desire in a husband looks like as per the research that you've done. I think a lot of times as women, Jay, we often think, well, if he's not wanting sex, it means he doesn't want me. It means that the stretch marks have proven too much for him to overlook. It means that the few extra pounds after this, or the wrinkles here, or the whatevers are impeding my personality, whatever the thing is, he doesn't want me. And that might be true in some cases, but what are you seeing in the deep dive you've done?
Yeah, the first question that most higher desire wives ask is, what's wrong with me?
Yeah.
What's wrong with me that he does not want me? And I think we need to kind of isolate those two things. That it could be that he wants you, but he doesn't necessarily want you through sex in that way. And a lot of times that is not about you at all. It's about stuff with him. So some of the reasons could be low testosterone. That is an option, although a lot of people want to go there almost exclusively, and that's usually not what it is, but it can be. Mm-hmm. It can be stress. It can be that he's not living very healthy, and so he does not have the energy to do those things. So if there's weight issues, diet issues, things like that, if he is having ongoing pain, there's also, for a lot of church guys, they also went through purity culture or messages about sex before marriage that made them suppress their sexuality. And so they also sometimes have difficulty flipping that switch when they get married and feeling open to being vulnerable and really engaging intimately with their wives. The one, though, these days I would really also talk about is pornography has had a huge, huge impact. And those husbands who are not watching pornography still likely grew up in a pornography culture. When I was growing up, you had to seek porn out. These days, you have to block porn out.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just a very different thing. And so a lot of our expectations have also been built by this porn culture. And you don't even also necessarily have to watch porn. Turn on a lot of the streaming channels, and some of the mature shows have somewhat pornographic stuff. And the way that they're expecting sex to unfold is not realistic. Right. And so a husband gets in there and he finds he's actually not as aroused by being with a person as maybe all of the adrenaline that he got before, or he's expecting her to be different, him to be different. He doesn't really know how to handle real life sex.
Right. That's something that I continue to see come up time and again. And Jay, one of the things that I think is really fascinating is the number of places I see the pornography issue addressed, and it's coming from places that aren't necessarily a faith-based content producer. So it may be from somebody who's, doing biohacking or talking about brain chemistry or neurology or all these different things I love to listen to on a medical level. And one of the things that continues to come up time and again is conversation about how pornography, even not looking at it from a moral standpoint, but for what it's doing to us physiologically and in our brain chemistry, is subverting a lot of the natural tendencies we would have in terms of sexual expression in the physical, in real life with another human. And it's taking it down a path from which people don't really kind of circle back. It seems to really suppress a lot of things in real life in a way that's quite ironic in a sense, because you would think that it would enhance that. Now, the flip side that I find interesting is that with a lot of the women today in our faith communities, we know that their pornography use is rising. I'm kind of curious if you think there is a correlation sometimes. I'm not saying if you're a higher desire wife that you're necessarily watching porn, but I am saying we have more examples today of female desire, and we have more content flying at us in that way. Do you think that plays a role sometimes in how we perceive our own desire levels?
Yes. In fact, in the book, I talk about we need to understand what a healthy level of desire is, because some higher desire wives out there have actually been fueled by sexual content. And that can definitely be pornography. It can also be erotica or just erotic romance or whatever it is. But we can be fueled by that kind of stuff and then end up stirring up our desire in such a way that it's become unhealthy. And we're basically expecting our husband to help us live out these fantasies instead of relating to him as a real person. And I'm a real person, and we're going to have to figure out how to build this healthy sexuality together.
Thank you to our sponsor, George Fox University. George Fox University is unique. It is a Christ-centered, student-focused university where your student is going to be appreciated for the individual they are, the learning style, and the goals that they have, while also keeping focus on their relationship with Christ. I want you to go check it out at georgefox.edu. Again, that's georgefox.edu. Thanks so much for being our sponsor, George Fox. Jay, give us a good baseline, because I do think we come at it from so many different perspectives today. Yes, the purity culture thing, the embedded messages we've had toward women about how you should be and what you shouldn't be and all the things. Our guys having been through some of those experiences as well. People who have deep regrets about some of their sexual history and now they're in a committed marriage. They're trying to figure that out. People who have little babies and everybody's exhausted. People who have teenagers in the house. I mean, all of these different things that are happening that influence what that sexual connection is. And yet I think sometimes we don't even have a great baseline of understanding in a way that is not mitigating gender. Well, women always want kind of conversation. What does godly, healthy sex in a marriage really look like? What do we know about that as people of faith, while pushing back against some of the almost rote kind of things, almost kind of cartoonishly simplified things that we sometimes say about marriage?
Well, I think that's one of the important things that you're talking about, is that this is complicated. Yeah. And all too often in the past, people had this idea that we're going to get married and we'll just figure it out. And there have even been couples who've told me, we went through premarital counseling, and when we got to the sex part, our counselor said, oh, sex. Well, and they looked embarrassed and they said, you'll figure that out when you get married. Yeah. And it's like, what makes you think that this is going to be perfect? And no one enters marriage being a perfect lover. Even if you were fantastic on your own, you've got to figure out how to become a really good lover for the spouse that you married. And they need to learn to become a really good lover for you. And there was this great study that also talked about how people who have a fixed mindset of sexual compatibility have really poor outcomes. But those people who have a positive mindset, who say, you know what, this is going to take some work. This is going to take some effort. It's going to take some communication and working together. They tended to have far better outcomes, far more satisfying sex lives. And so just recognizing that it might be complicated is a good place to start. That doesn't mean that it's going to be bad. Some things can be complicated and still be really good. It's complicated to put together a roller coaster, but I have a lot of fun when it's all together and I ride it. Yeah. So same thing with your sex life, and having been married now 32 years, I can honestly say there's just things about my body that my husband knows, and things I know about his body, and the way we make love. We're better lovers for one another now because we went through all this learning process. So I think that's one of the kind of base setting things, is just to recognize it's something you're going to be working on throughout your marriage.
I think we have some really loaded terms that we talk about in terms of sex and marriage, which you are referencing here, which is chemistry and compatibility. And I would
Mm-hmm.
love to hear from you from the perspective of someone who routinely is counseling and teaching in the area of sex. What do you think about those two terms? Is chemistry, is compatibility, is that some kind of thing we've created? Is there really something on the biophysical level when it comes to those elements? How do you see all of that, and how does that play into what's truly possible within a satisfying sexual marriage?
Well, we usually did have some chemistry when we first started out with our husband. And so there was something that drew us to him. We got little flutters in our tummy. We felt excited to be around him. We couldn't wait to hold his hand, whatever that looked like. We had some of that chemistry. But what tends to happen is after a few years, that kind of level of, sparking all the time does seem to settle. And what we need to realize is that chemistry then starts to go deeper. And so now it becomes maybe a little more about companionship and building this life together and communicating about deeper sides of ourselves. And we need to keep doing that. You need to keep being a student of your spouse throughout your marriage. I've heard this thing, I think maybe you've said this too, that you will have more than one marriage with your husband, in the sense that I'm not the exact same person I was when we got married 30 something years ago. So we've had to kind of continue to learn with each other. But doing that actually keeps a spark alive. It's not going to feel quite like the original chemistry, but it's still going to be really strong.
Right.
And I think the compatibility is also something that you continue to build, and also realize that compatibility does not mean that you are exactly like each other. That's not, you can be compatible with people who complement you, who stretch you. And that's also part of this area of trying to figure out your mismatched drives. This is also an opportunity to say, okay, how can I minister to you? How can you minister to me? How can we strengthen this bond as we try to figure out the frequency of our sexual intimacy, the repertoire that we're going to have in the bedroom, our arousal and climax, and those kinds of things that we have to kind of be able to do some give and take to figure it out.
It's unfortunate in our culture that we have often tagged those intentional conversations, those getting it on the calendar kind of seasons. We tend to tag that as not romantic. That in a deeply romantic relationship, you wouldn't have to communicate those things. I fall victim to that at times too, because it's uncomfortable sometimes to have those conversations that are that targeted. But what I hear you saying is that to keep chemistry, you got to talk, you got to chat. Like there's got to be those conversations taking place. For the woman who is listening to this thinking, yeah, I'm one of that potential 25%, that 1 in 4 women sitting at the PTA meeting who is thinking, why doesn't this guy want me anymore? What has happened here? Because there's such a wash of things that could be going on, everything from physical symptoms to him, to maybe something at work, to porn usage, to whatever. How does a wife begin to have that conversation in a culture in which sometimes those conversations are not considered very romantic? How do you broach that subject without making your guy feel like he's failing, or you're disappointed in him, or he's less than? Equip us with some tools for that.
That's a great question. And I will first say it really helps to start with some compassion, because a lot of lower desire husbands do not want to admit this is what's going on with them.
Yeah.
They'll get into groups with other men, and the men will talk about how much they want sex and this is that. And I've even had higher desire wives say, we were at a barbecue and I overheard him laughing it up with his friends going, yeah, that's right. And she knows, nope, that's not how it is at home. But if he admits that, in some places, it's like they're going to say, well, we're going to take your man card because you're supposed to want sex more than your wife. And that's a message not only in church, but in a lot of secular stuff too. A lot of sitcoms and books and stuff also assume that as well. So starting out with some compassion really helps. And then also making sure you have these conversations as safely as possible, because this is a vulnerable thing. Our sexuality is such a vulnerable place for us. It is a place of not just body openness, but our heart is so attached to that. And we recognize this as a private area that we are now allowing someone else to have such access to. And so sometimes it's hard to discuss those things in a safe way. So the best thing to do is, first of all, you probably shouldn't be discussing this in the bedroom, because that may be where some tension has been happening.
Location. That's a great tip.
And not probably right before or right after sex. Pick another time and say, you know what? I've been thinking about our sexual intimacy and I really want us to talk about it. I know it's a sensitive topic, but I'd like to find a time where we can just be calm and talk about what's going on. And then, go someplace, even location wise, also go someplace that feels either positive or neutral for him. It could be sitting next to each other on the couch. It could be sitting next to him on his fishing boat. I don't know what that looks like. And I also tell a lot of wives that men, when they interact, they tend to do more shoulder to shoulder activities. And we tend to be more comfortable doing face to face. But if you are able to sit beside him and maybe, or take a walk with him and hold his hand, and he doesn't have to look at you when he's talking about what's going on with him, that can actually feel safer.
Jay Parker has been so generous with her time that she allowed me to keep her even longer. So this is a little bit of a mini series. It's a two-parter. You just got to listen to part 1. We'll be back next week with part 2. I want to encourage you to go check out Jay Parker's website, hotholyhumorous.com. That's hotholyhumorous.com. You'll also find links there for her podcast and a lot of other great work that she's doing. I also want to remind you, go to allmomdoes.com on the socials, on the web. You're going to find a great community there. I love to hear from you too. Julie Lyles Carr, primarily hang out on Instagram. Hey, do me a big favor. We love it when you take the link from an episode and send it over to a friend. If you know someone who is grappling with intimacy issues in their marriage, if you know someone who's in this scenario where they seem to have a higher drive than their spouse, this could be a great way to open that conversation and to resource them from a Christian perspective with ideas and tools that they need to help get their marriage back on track. So we love it when you share things like this. We really appreciate it. So be sure and tune in next week when we will have part 2 of The Higher Desire Wife with our guest, Jay Parker.